They were never supposed to be there. That's what scientists kept repeating over and over again as they stared at the stone tools laid out on the table. Primitive hand axes, sharp flakes, hammerstones worn smooth with use. Basic, sure, but unmistakably made by someone. The problem wasn't the tools, it was where they were found. Sulawesi, a jungle-covered island in Indonesia, cut off by deep ocean trenches, isolated by geography. According to every model of human migration we've built so far, no hominin, ancient human, should have ever made it there, not until tens of thousands of years ago. But these tools, they were over 1.5 million years old, older than Homo sapiens, older than Neanderthals, older than Homo floresiensis, the so-called hobbits of Indonesia, older than anyone we thought was even capable of getting there. And that's where everything starts to unravel, because if the dating is right, and it is, that means someone crossed hundreds of miles of open ocean, reached Sulawesi, and settled there over 1 million years before we thought ocean crossings were possible. That's not just early, that's impossible. But the tools are real, the site is real, the mystery is real, and the closer you look at it, the weirder it gets. Let's go back to the beginning. In 2016, a team of researchers was excavating a remote area of Sulawesi called the Walani Basin. It wasn't a flashy expedition, no ancient temples, no buried treasure, just sediment, bones, and time. But then, they hit a layer that didn't match the rest. Scattered among ancient fossils were clear signs of tool use. Stone flakes that had been chipped deliberately, signs of percussion, and simple cutting edges shaped by force. But here's where it gets really strange. The bones found with the tools weren't human. They belonged to extinct animals, ancient relatives of pigs and small elephants that once roamed the island. And those bones showed signs of butchery, clean cuts, breaks at the joints, tool marks, as if someone had hunted these animals and then carved them up. So the team kept digging, and the deeper they went, the older it got. Eventually, they uncovered 149 stone tools. Most were simple, Oldowan style, the kind you'd associate with Homo erectus in Africa. Nothing fancy, but unmistakably made by intelligent hands, or at least, intelligent enough. The team brought the artifacts to the lab. They ran test after test, dated the sediments using 26 aluminum over 10 beryllium burial dating, a method that tracks how long minerals have been underground, exposed to cosmic rays. And the result? 1.8 to 1.9 million years old. They didn't believe it, so they checked again. Same result. The tools weren't just ancient, they were impossibly ancient. According to everything we know, hominins didn't reach Sulawesi until 50,000 years ago, when Homo sapiens finally made the crossing. So who made these tools, and how did they get there? This wasn't just an archaeological puzzle, it was a timeline destroyer. Because if humans, or some other human-like species, reached Sulawesi that early, it would mean ocean crossings happened at least 1 million years earlier than we ever thought possible. It would mean the history of human migration isn't a slow, step-by-step march out of Africa. It's a shattered mirror, and that mirror breaks right here in the wet, volcanic soil of a forgotten Indonesian valley. But here's the part that no one talks about. This wasn't the first time strange tools had been found on Sulawesi. Back in the 1940s, Dutch archaeologists discovered something similar, primitive tools in surprisingly old layers of earth. But their findings were dismissed. The dating was called unreliable. The tools were labeled ambiguous. And the whole idea that ancient humans had reached Sulawesi was quietly shelved because it didn't fit the model. And in science, if it doesn't fit the model, it gets ignored. Until now, this new discovery couldn't be explained away. The dating was solid, the tools were undeniable, and the implications were massive. It meant that someone crossed the Wallace Line, one of the deepest ocean barriers on Earth, long before modern humans even existed. That line separates the biogeographic zones of Asia and Australasia. It's not a small stream or a shallow lake. It's a brutal expanse of water that even modern sailors find difficult. So how did they do it? Rafts, dugout canoes, driftwood, or was it something we haven't even considered? This is where the mystery really starts to open, because now we're not just talking about tools. We're talking about the first sailors in history, beings who may have learned to navigate open ocean a million years before we ever gave them credit. And that brings up a much darker question. If they were capable of that, what else were they capable of? For decades, the story of human evolution was simple. Too simple. Africa was the origin. Homo erectus left first, spreading slowly into Asia. Then came the Neanderthals, and eventually, us, Homo sapiens. We walked out of Africa around 70,000 years ago, crossed into Europe, then Asia, then the rest of the world, clean, linear, understandable. But the moment a 1.8 million-year-old stone tool shows up on an isolated Indonesian island, that story collapses, because it means someone else, not us, got there first. Someone we didn't know existed. Someone capable of traveling across vast stretches of open ocean at a time when we believed no one could. And the question that haunts researchers now is this: who were they? Let's consider the suspects. The most obvious answer is Homo erectus. They were the first known hominin to leave Africa, appearing in the fossil record around 1.9 million years ago. We found their remains in Dmanisi, Georgia, as early as 1.8 million years ago, then in China, then in Java, Indonesia. The timing matches, the capability, not so much, because according to everything we thought we knew, Homo erectus walked. They didn't sail, they didn't build boats, they didn't even live in coastal communities, as far as we can tell. And yet, here we are, with tools in Sulawesi, across the Wallace Line, dated to exactly the time Homo erectus was supposedly spreading, which means one of two things. Either Homo erectus was far more advanced than we ever imagined, or it wasn't them at all. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Homo erectus was clever. They used fire, crafted tools. They spread across continents and adapted to wildly different environments. If they did cross the Wallace Line, that would make them the first sailors in human history, a title we never thought to give them. But if they didn't, then who did? That brings us to the second suspect, a completely unknown species, one that hasn't been discovered yet, a ghost lineage, a group of hominins that left no skeletons, no fossils, no clear trail, just tools. This isn't speculation. In recent years, genetic studies have shown that early humans in Asia interbred with other hominin species we haven't even identified yet. Their DNA shows up in us, but their bones have never been found. They are invisible ancestors, ghosts in the genetic code. And maybe, just maybe, one of those ghost species left tools behind in Sulawesi. We've seen this before. Take Homo luzonensis, discovered in the Philippines in 2019, a tiny human relative previously unknown who lived around 67,000 years ago. Or Homo floresiensis, the famous hobbits of Flores Island, Indonesia, standing just over 3 feet tall. Both were isolated, unique, and unexpected, and both appeared on islands that required ocean crossings. That's the part no one wants to talk about. These weren't landlocked species. They were island hoppers, seafarers, survivors, and Sulawesi fits that pattern perfectly. It's part of Wallacea, a string of islands surrounded by deep water trenches, never connected to the mainland, not even during the Ice Age. Which means whoever got there had to cross the sea on purpose. And here's where it gets even weirder. In 2022, another team found evidence of butchered stegodon bones, an extinct dwarf elephant, also in Sulawesi, also associated with ancient tools. The bones were broken in ways that suggest controlled hunting and systematic processing, not random scavenging. Hunting. That implies intelligence, planning, social coordination, traits we usually reserve for Homo sapiens. But these bones were at least 700,000 years old, long before sapiens appeared, which means someone or something was thriving on this island long-term, repeatedly, possibly for hundreds of thousands of years. So let's zoom out. What if Sulawesi was just one piece of a much bigger puzzle? What if Southeast Asia was once home to a network of unknown hominin species, each adapted to island life, each with its own technology, culture, and survival strategy? And what if we're only just starting to uncover them? Because the truth is, tropical environments like Sulawesi are brutal on fossils. Bones rot, DNA degrades, and jungle swallows everything. But stone tools? They last. And these tools, 149 of them, are now whispering a story we were never meant to hear. Let's go deeper. Some researchers believe the hominins who reached Sulawesi may have evolved in complete isolation, cut off from the rest of humanity, shaped by the island itself, just like the hobbits of Flores. Over time, they could have developed their own unique physiology, their own behaviors, maybe even their own language. And if they survived for hundreds of thousands of years, what kind of culture did they build? Did they have myths? Rituals? Did they pass down knowledge from one generation to the next? And if so, could any trace of that knowledge remain? It's tempting to dismiss all of this as speculation, but that's the problem. Every major discovery starts as speculation, right up until someone digs it up. A decade ago, no one believed Homo luzonensis existed. 2 decades ago, the idea that Neanderthals and humans interbred was controversial. Now it's textbook. Science changes, but only when it's forced to. And right now, the Sulawesi tools are forcing a change. Here's what we know. The tools are real, the dating is solid, and the implications are massive. We don't know who made them. We don't know how they got there, but we do know one thing: someone did, and that someone changes everything. Because if ocean crossings happened 1,000,000 years earlier than we thought, then we've been underestimating our ancestors for far too long. They weren't just survival machines, they were thinkers, explorers, problem solvers, and maybe, just maybe, they weren't so different from us after all. So what happened to them? Did they die out? Get replaced by Homo sapiens? Or is it possible that fragments of their story still exist, buried under ash, hidden in caves, waiting to be found? Because if they reached Sulawesi, where else did they go? Well, there's an invisible boundary in the ocean, one that most people have never heard of. It doesn't show up on tourist maps. It has nothing to do with politics. But in the world of biology and evolution, it's a wall. A hard line, a dividing force that has shaped life in Southeast Asia for millions of years. It's called the Wallace Line, and for early humans, it might as well have been a force field. Discovered in the 19th century by British naturalist Alfred Russel Wallace, the Wallace Line runs between the islands of Borneo and Sulawesi, and again between Bali and Lombok. On one side of the line, the animal species look familiar: tigers, elephants, monkeys. On the other side, everything changes. Marsupials, giant lizards, birds that can't fly. The line marks a deep water trench that never disappeared, not even during the Ice Age when sea levels dropped and land bridges appeared elsewhere. That means no animals or humans could simply walk across. To get past the Wallace Line, you had to sail, and that's the problem. Mainstream archaeology says humans didn't develop ocean navigation until 40,000 to 50,000 years ago. That's when we supposedly began hopping between islands in the Pacific, eventually reaching Australia. But the tools found in Sulawesi, they're at least 1.8 million years old. That's over 30 times older than the earliest known boats, which means either our ancestors crossed the sea over 1,000,000 years earlier than we thought, or someone else did it first. Let's step back. Why is the Wallace Line so important? Because it separates more than just species. It separates assumptions from reality. Every time a new discovery appears east of that line, it shatters something we thought we knew about human migration. Flores, for example, home of the hobbit humans, Homo floresiensis, is east of the Wallace Line. That species wasn't supposed to be there. Same with Homo luzonensis in the Philippines, and now Sulawesi. Every time we dig, the story gets stranger. So how did they cross? The standard answer is maybe by accident. Maybe a group of hominins got swept away by a storm, clinging to vegetation or logs, and just happened to survive the journey. But let's be honest, that only works once. It doesn't explain repeated crossings. It doesn't explain settlements. It doesn't explain 149 stone tools scattered in a strategic location. Accidents don't leave organized patterns. Survival doesn't look like a fluke. It looks like a plan. And here's where the real tension begins. Because if there was a plan, there was intention. And if there was intention, there was intelligence. Complex intelligence. The kind we've only ever attributed to Homo sapiens. But now we're forced to consider that maybe Homo erectus or someone else was capable of building rafts, reading currents, timing the tides. Maybe they watched the stars. Maybe they had primitive language. Maybe they weren't just walking out of Africa. Maybe they were exploring. Let that sink in. For decades, we've believed that Homo sapiens were the first true explorers, the first to think beyond the horizon. But what if we weren't? What if that sense of curiosity, of adventure, runs deeper in our lineage than we ever realized? What if it began not 70,000 years ago, but 1.8 million? There's another layer to this. Think about what happens when a species reaches an island. Isolation, evolution, time. The hominins who crossed the Wallace Line wouldn't have stayed the same. Over hundreds of thousands of years, they would have changed, physically, cognitively, culturally, which means the moment they stepped foot on Sulawesi, their story branched off into something entirely new. A forgotten chapter, a lost experiment in human evolution that we're only now beginning to rediscover. And here's where things get eerie. In parts of Indonesia, there are ancient cave paintings, some over 45,000 years old. They depict animals, hand stencils, hunting scenes. These are some of the oldest known artworks in the world, found in places like Lingbulu Sepong in Sulawesi. The official narrative says they were made by Homo sapiens, but some researchers aren't so sure. Because if earlier, hominins were already living on these islands for hundreds of thousands of years, why wouldn't they have developed symbolic thinking? Why wouldn't they have painted? It's a controversial idea, but it fits the pattern. Everything we've learned about human evolution in the last 20 years has pushed the timeline further back. Article tools, burials, language, all of it used to be uniquely human. Now we know Neanderthals had rituals, Denisovans left jewelry, and maybe, just maybe, some unknown species in Sulawesi left behind the first brushstrokes of creativity. If that's true, then the Wallace Line wasn't just a geographical boundary. It was a filter hiding an entire world of forgotten intelligence. So what does this mean for us? It means the story of humanity isn't linear. It's not a straight line from primitive to advanced. It's a tangled web of parallel experiments, lost branches, and unrecorded genius. And some of that genius might be buried beneath volcanic ash, or hidden in the dense jungle of Sulawesi, waiting to be found. And here's the kicker. If they crossed the Wallace Line once, they could have crossed others. They could have reached Timor, the Philippines, maybe even Australia, long before we think anyone ever did. And if tools or bones from 1.8 million years ago show up in those places, everything changes again. This isn't about rewriting history for the sake of it. It's about finally listening to the evidence. The tools in Sulawesi aren't anomalies. They're signals. They're saying, you've underestimated us. You've ignored us. But we were here. We mattered. So the next time someone tells you the first explorers were modern humans, remember the Wallace Line. Remember the trench that couldn't be crossed, and remember the species that crossed it anyway. Thanks for watching. If you want more forgotten discoveries and real mysteries from deep history, subscribe and turn on notifications. Until next time, keep questioning everything.